The Portuguese Golden Age of exploration expanded Europe's reach to the edges of Asia, changing the course of world history. In 1543, two Portuguese explorers, Antonio Mota and Francisco Zeimoto, made history by becoming the first Europeans to reach Japan. Their unintended arrival on Japanese shores catalyzed a chain of events that would leave a lasting mark on Japanese society, particularly through the introduction of the arquebus. This weapon would very rapidly completely reshape the nature of warfare in Japan, much as it had done in other parts of the world. Antonio Mota and Francisco Zeimoto were likely typical of the Portuguese explorers of their era. Though we can't know for certain, they were likely motivated by a combination of economic opportunity and the chance to navigate uncharted waters. Mota and Zeimoto embarked from Siam, modern-day Thailand, traveling aboard a Chinese junk bound for Ningbo, a prominent Chinese trade port. A severe storm, however, altered their course, and instead of China, they landed on the shores of Tanegashima, a small island south of Kyushu, Japan's third largest island. Accounts indicate that the journey was marked by hardships, including the loss of a fellow sailor who did not survive the voyage. Nonetheless, the arrival of Mota and Zeimoto with their Chinese companions marked the beginning of European-Japanese relations. The relationship between the Portuguese and the Japanese would completely change the socio-political landscape of Japan over the next century. Also, it's important to briefly mention another claimant to the title of the first European in Japan, Fernão Mendes Pinto. He had a significant impact on facilitating early trade with Japan. However, most historians do not view his account of his arrival in Japan as accurate. He claimed that he arrived in Japan with Mota and Zeimoto. However, his own memoirs contradict themselves, and he indicated that he was in Burma at the same time. In essence, it appears that he took the factual story of Mota and Zeimoto and claimed it for his own in his memoirs. But let's get back to Mota and Zeimoto. The Japanese greeted these newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as may be expected. Europeans, with their strange clothing and unfamiliar appearance, were seen as Nanban, or Southern barbarians. The term is originally derived from the Chinese term Nanman, which was originally used for tribal people from southern China in antiquity. Nanban was used by the Japanese to label people from regions to their south who did not adhere to Japanese customs. However, it generally became a term for most foreigners, aside from Koreans and Chinese, with whom the Japanese of the period had a great deal of familiarity. Zeimoto and Mota, on the other hand, initially assumed that the Japanese locals they found were actually Chinese. The arrival of the Portuguese also brought a previously unseen kind of vessel, the Chinese junk modified with Portuguese fittings, which aroused immediate interest. Zeimoto and Mota's distinct appearance and their unfamiliar language made a profound and immediate impression. These two curiosities were soon summoned by Tanegashima Tokitaka, the young daimyo, or feudal lord, of the island. And when I say young here, Tokitaka was only 15 years old and potentially more open to new and exciting ideas and technologies. Tokitaka's curiosity about these strange men quickly turned to fascination when he noticed they carried a unique piece of equipment, the arquebus. Unlike traditional Japanese weapons, the arquebus could project lethal force across considerable distances, something the daimyo had never encountered. Recognizing the potential of this technology, Tokitaka requested a demonstration. According to historical accounts, when a shot was fired, the thunderous sound and visible impact left the daimyo and his retinue in awe. This encounter led Tokitaka to acquire two arquebuses at an extremely high price, and he wasted no time in commissioning his own craftsmen to reproduce them. Japanese swordsmiths, while skilled in metalwork, initially struggled to replicate the intricate mechanisms of the arquebus. This challenge prompted Tokitaka to invite a Portuguese blacksmith to Tanegashima to aid in the manufacturing process. The Portuguese blacksmith arrived in 1544, and crucially, instead of being used to simply produce the weapons, Tokitaka had him teach his local craftsmen to make the weapons. By 1544, Japan had successfully begun its journey to indigenous firearm production, with the locally made guns becoming known as Tanegashima after the island. Notably, the Tanegashima arquebus would be innovated upon until complete consolidation of Japan by the Tokugawa clan after the siege of Osaka in 1615. After this point, the arquebus remained in use until the 19th century, as Japan enjoyed a period of approximately 250 years of near-complete peace. After Antonio Mota and Francisco Zeimoto's landmark arrival in Japan, historical records diverge somewhat on their exact fates. The limited available information suggests that after the initial Tanegashima encounter, the explorers continued their maritime activities. The scholarly consensus appears to be that it's most likely they returned to various Portuguese trading outposts across Asia. However, precise details of their later lives remain unclear, as documentation is sparse. Personally, I like to speculate that they may have leveraged their connections in Japan to further conduct Japanese trade. However, it's important to state that this is just speculation. However, I do believe this makes sense, as the men appear to have stayed some period of time in Japan and were by definition the most well-versed Europeans in Japanese customs. This understanding of Japanese custom may have been important in establishing the coming lucrative trade with the Japanese. But before we discuss that any further, it's necessary to discuss how the arquebus completely revolutionized Japanese warfare. The introduction of the arquebus had transformative effects on Japanese society, particularly during the Sengoku period. While the exact definition of this period is beyond the scope of this video, this was a period in the 15th and 16th century where rival daimyo constantly battled for control over land. Firearms quickly spread across Japan, with various feudal lords recognizing the advantage they offered in battle. The arquebus became a decisive tool, particularly in the hands of Oda Nobunaga, a major feudal lord who would eventually initiate Japan's unification. Nobunaga famously deployed arquebuses on a large scale during the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, arranging them in rows to fire in volleys. This volley firing pattern was similar to methods worked out in European theaters of war and had the exact same effect. The volley fire proved capable of overwhelming his opponents, which in turn changed Japanese warfare forever. Notably, there's some dispute over whether the Oda forces invented this technique independently, or whether they were influenced by Portuguese or Spanish tactics. By the late 16th century, Japan was one of the most well-armed countries in the world, with more firearms than many European nations. This development set Japan apart, as it was one of the few non-European nations to master firearm production at scale during this period. Notably, this mastery over firearms production by the end of the 16th century likely drastically reduced the chance of Japan dominated by any European powers. Mota and Zeimoto's arrival on Japanese shores heralded the beginning of a complex relationship between Japan and Portugal that extended beyond technology. The Portuguese established a lucrative trade network in Japan, exchanging goods such as Chinese silk, pottery, and sugar in return for silver, one of Japan's most valuable resources. This trade soon became part of the broader Nanban trade, which connected Japan to the rest of the world through Portuguese and Spanish intermediaries. With Portuguese merchants came Catholic missionaries, most notably the Jesuits, who sought to convert the Japanese to Christianity. Figures like Francis Xavier, who arrived in 1549, began spreading Christianity in Japan, attracting many followers among the Japanese nobility. These missionaries not only introduced religious ideas but also facilitated the exchange of knowledge in areas like cartography, medicine, and astronomy. Jesuit schools introduced Western science and education to Japan, creating an environment where cultural exchange went beyond mere trade. The arrival of Portuguese explorers and missionaries fundamentally altered Japanese society, bringing new goods, technologies, and ideologies. This period of interaction, although short lived, left an indelible mark on Japan. The Japanese eventually chose to adopt some aspects of Western technology, including firearms, while rejecting other aspects of Western culture. This eventually culminated in the expulsion of most Western influence through restrictive policies, culminating in the Sengoku, or closed country policy, in the early 17th century. This was so restrictive that for over 200 years, only the Dutch were allowed any trade with Japan. Western influence was viewed with such caution that the Dutch were forced to conduct their trade from an artificial island off Nagasaki called Dejima. That said, the extremely lucrative nature of the trade ensured that the tradition of Western trade, which began with the accidental arrival of Antonio Mota and Francisco Zeimoto, continued. But that's a very interesting story for a future video. Leave a comment below if you'd like to learn more about the Dutch role in Edo-era Japan. Thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell and turn on notifications. Make sure to check out my channel for other history content, including an ancient civilization series, which is now up to 2 hours. Also be sure to check out my main channel, Lazy Chill Zone, where I deal with unsolved mysteries, true crime, the occult, mythology, and religion and more.